Herkese iyi akşamlar. Bu defa konuğum Julian Stallabrass, 26 Mart 2021 ve konuğum Londra'dan katılıyor bize, Courtauld Enstitüsü'nden. Kısaca kendisini bir tanıtmak isterim. Lytton Park School'dan sonra Oxford Üniversitesi'nde New College'dan aslında hem felsefe, politika, ekonomi alanında çalıştıktan sonra aslında kendisi bir sanat tarihçi ve fotoğraf sanatçısı olarak çalışıyor Courtauld Institute of Art'ta. Genellikle çağdaş sanatla ilgili çalışıyor. Çağdaş sanatın da global etkileri üzerine çalışıyor. Kendisiyle hangi konuda verebileceği üzerine tartışmıştık ve birlikte karar verdik aslında. Ben çağdaş sanat ve aktivizmi daha önceliklendirdim ve özellikle global piyasa, yani sanat piyasasında belli tröstler, bazı büyük devlerin yönettiği sistemler ve sanatın gerçekten istenileni mi yansıttığı yoksa yönetildiği mi üzerine bugün konuşacak. Ve şimdi sözü kendisine vermek istiyorum. Zaten kitapları var. Türkçe'ye çevrilmiş bir Sanat A.Ş. diye kitabı var. Tabii o kitabı şu an çok gerilerde kaldı. Kendisini aslında Marksist olarak ve dünyadaki sistemlerin aslında evreni korumak ve tek bir dünya gibi düşünmek gerektiği üzerine kurgulu. Ve bu anlamda da yaptığı çalışmalarda tabii bunun bir yansıması olarak kendisini gösteriyor. Now that I actually gave an introductory information about you, it's all yours, the screen, and I will try to translate as you go. So if you could give me some time in between slides, I appreciate that.
Yes. I think I may try and pause after each paragraph or something of that sort, if that's all right with you.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, great. So thank you so much, Bila, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you. I want to talk to you about aspects of activism in contemporary art, and over a fairly long time period, from around the mid-1990s through to the present. And I think there have been some real shifts in artistic practice and in the attitude of the art world to activism in that time.
...1990'ların ortasından sonra çağdaş sanatta ilerlemeler ve aslında çağdaş sanatla ifade edilen aktivizm üzerine konuşacağım bugün. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I think that recent events point to an evolving systemic crisis in capitalism. The long-lasting recession, which has for over a decade weakened many nations, fallout from the US imperial project, which has manifested in failed states, apparently endless civil wars and massive migration, increasingly catastrophic environmental events, harbingers of worse to come, and lately, of course, a pandemic, probably caused by human encroachment on wilderness, which has caused the deepest global recession in living memory. And in all of this, stranded and frail neoliberal governments promise, but can't deliver, merely a return to the feeble growth rates and rampant inequality of the pre-crash era. So because of this, their hold on the reins of power loosens. I can't hear you, Bila.
2008'den beri aslında devam eden ve sanat dünyasında aslında çatlaklar yaratan gerilimler, çatışmalar ve bir taraftan da aslında sistematik krizler son 10 yıldır özellikle devam eden bir durgunluk ama bir taraftan da başarısız devletlerde görünüşte bitmeyen iç savaşlar, kitlesel göçler ve özellikle Amerika'nın emperyalist projelerinin sonuçları olarak farklı aslında olaylara gebe oldu ve daha da kötülerin habercisi özellikle son zamanlarda yaşayan bellekte en derin küresel durgunluğu tehdit eden ve vahşi doğaya insan müdahalesinin neden olduğu salgın, bir taraftan da aslında mahsur kalmış kırılgan neoliberal hükümetler. Yalnızca aslında bu dönemin zayıf büyüme oranları değil, yaygın eşitsizlik gibi konuları da ortaya çıkarıyor ve güç dizginleri de aslında biraz gevşiyor. Yes.
So in contemporary art, a profound rift has opened up between the marketized art directed at the super rich, extravagantly expensive, and often quite standardized, in which the mismatch between busy PR and dull product is very evident, and a world of artistic social activism, which has evolved from its merely gestural acts against an overwhelmingly powerful system. Now sensing both the system's weakness and impending disaster, it's become more urgent and insolent. In mapping the political and artistic reaction against this world of catastrophe and consumption, I'm going to look first at a few exceptional figures, some of whom made work long before the current crisis. And these, in a sense, could be accepted as outliers among all the kind of postmodern offerings otherwise present. But then I'm going to look at individual artists who became celebrated as activists, which is a different matter, indicative of a shift. And lastly, to collectives who pursue targeted and often effective action against the wreckers.
Çağdaş sanatta zengin ve öne çıkan ve genellikle alışılmamış, standartlaşmış olan pazarlanmış sanat arasında derin bir uçurum aslında açıldı ve hareketli PR'la donuk ürün arasındaki uyumsuzluk ortaya çıktı ve bir taraftan da ezici bir çoğunlukla güçlü bir sisteme karşı yalnızca performatif ve jestsel eylemlerden gelişen bir sanat, sosyal aktivizm dünyası bir taraftan da şimdilerde sistemin zayıflığı ve yaklaşmakta olan felaketi hisseden acil isyancı bir sanatsal tavra dönüştü. Ve bu aslında tüketim dünyasına karşı siyasi ve sanatsal tepkiyi haritalandırırken mevcut krizden çok önce çalışan birkaç istisnai figürlere bakacağım ben. Ve bu kişilerin aslında aktivist olarak ünlenen bu bireysel sanatçılar bir taraftan da değişimin de göstergeleri ve bunlar üzerinde durmaya çalışacağım. Yes.
So I want to start with someone who has become one of the world's most celebrated photographers, though he was far from that when making this work. When I first saw it as photocopies pasted up onto the walls of a hut at the Zapatista Intercontinental Encounter for Humanity and Against Neoliberalism, this is one of the huts here, in 1996. So just a few words about this event, since it was the origin point for the rise of the global protests against capitalism. It was the Zapatista staged an uprising in Chiapas in southern Mexico in 1994, in which indigenous people protesting the free trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, in which free trade was favored over their right to eat, seized an occupied territory. And they continue to hold and expand this territory, which they govern under a system of participatory democracy. As Walter Mignolo argues, this action was the product of a long and transformative exchange of thought between indigenous people and once Marxist activists who'd spent decades with them in the jungle. In 1996, the Zapatistas held this intercontinental encounter, as they called it, a remarkable conference attended by thousands of activists, which helped seed the anti-capitalist movement. Colonial history, of which the Zapatistas are acutely aware, was seen as absolutely central to the development of capitalism, with legacies that structure the present.
Dünyanın bugün aslında en ünlü fotoğrafçılardan biri olarak bilinen Salgado ile başlamak istiyorum söze. Ben Salgado'nun 1996'da Zapatista'nın insanlık için kıtalar arası karşılaşma ve neoliberalizme karşı olan işini bir kulübenin duvarına yapıştırılan fotokopilerle gördüm. Kapitalizme karşı küresel protestoların yükselişinin bir başlangıç noktası olduğu için bu olay enteresan bir bütün olarak sömürgecilik dışı bir hareket ve 1994'te Chiapas yani Meksika'nın güney eyaleti Chiapas'daki Zapatista ayaklanmaları üzerine olan bu belgeleme yerli halkın yani onların haklarının ele geçirilmesi ve serbest ticaretin tercih edildiği Kuzey Amerika Ticaret Sözleşmesi'ne onların protestolarıyla çeşitlenen bir sanat hareketi ve Arjantinli kültürel antropolog Walter Mignolo'nun da öne sürdüğü gibi bu eylem yerli halkın aslında son 10 yıllarını bu süre öncesinde Lacando Ormanı'nda geçirmiş Marksist aktivistler arasında uzun ve dönüştürücü bir düşünce alışverişinin ürünü ve 1996'da Zapatistalar bu anti-kapitalizm hareketinin aktive hale gelmesini düzenlediler. Bu büyük bir hareketti aslında kolonyal tarih açısından ve bütün bu aslında sistemin de kapitalizm gelişimli olduğunu düşünüyorlardı. Ve bu aktivistlerin bir araya geldiği konu aslında Topraksız Halk Hareketi, MST diye bilinen aktivasyondu. Ve ben aslında fotoğrafları çeken Salgado'nun bir taraftan da aslında onların eylemcisi gibi bir sanatçı olarak öne çıktığını gördüm. Yes. A very long translation.
Okay. Well, I was going to tease you with the name of this photographer, but I think Bilur has given it away. So, yes, as I say, these photographs were displayed anonymously on behalf of the Landers People's Movement in Brazil. And so this was one of the photographs I saw, didn't know who it was by. I remember thinking at the time, they have some very good photographers working for them. And it was only later that I learned that it was by Salgado when he made his book Terra, or Earth. And this book is dedicated to the cause of the MST, the land occupation movement. And it documents the plight of the landless camped out on the highways of Brazil, waiting to occupy land, as here. Their schools and creches, which they set up once they have occupied the land, like this. And the dramatic occupations themselves, as when a column of thousands of peasants breaks through the gate of one of these big landed estates as Salgado puts it, scythes, hoes, and banners raised in the unrestrained avalanche of hope.
Ben aslında Salgado'nun bu Terra adlı kitabıyla tanıştım ve bu Brezilyalı belgesel fotoğrafçısından çok etkilendim. Bu Brezilya aslında MST hareketinin fotoğrafçısı olarak topraklarını geri almaya çalışan kişilerin umutlarını fotoğraf karesine saklayan, ellerinde tırpanlar, çapalar, pankartlarla aslında haklarını arayan kişiler, okulda çocuklar, kreşlerde, sokaklarda bunu resmetmesi beni çok etkiledi. Go ahead.
Salgado also witnessed the massacre of peasants by police at Pará in 1995 and photographs the bodies, the wake, and the mourners. Now, Salgado's work has always been committed to progressive social change in a general sense, but in Terra the claim is much more explicit. And this produces a qualitative change in the work. Here is a set of photographs which are certainly meant to be seen as art, placed in the service of a political movement. The MST photographs were not at least initially seen in conventional gallery displays. Rather, they've been exhibited as posters, not fine photographic prints, simultaneously in many venues all over Europe, including churches and charities and the galleries if they want them. The production of these posters were in large editions of 5,000, which sold for £10 each. And that production was financed from the royalties from Salgado's book. And the money raised from the sale goes directly back to the movement, the MST. So the venues, the quality of the poster reproductions, the likely audience of charity workers and political activists, as well as art lovers, indicate that this is not exactly or not only a fine art display. And the pictures are also changed when the MST uses them, as we've seen from my first encounter with them. And the consumption of these photographs is very different for different audiences. So they're effective fundraising tools in the West and propaganda tools in Central and South America.
Salgado'nun 1995'te Para'da polis tarafından köylülerin katledilmesine tanık olması, ayrıca cenaze fotoğrafları ve yas tutanları fotoğraflaması dışında aslında hep toplumu, yani ilerici bir toplumsal değişime adanmış bakış açısı özellikle Terra adlı kitabında çok ortaya çıkar. Niteliksel bir değişim yaratır. Aslında bu siyasi hareketin hizmetine gönül vermiş olması kuşkusuz onu aslında sanatsal değeri olan fotoğraflar ürettiğini göstermesi açısından önemli. Ayrıca da hem nostaljik, hem muhafazakar, hem humanist, hem geleneksel güzellik barındıran bu fotoğraflar bir taraftan MST fotoğrafları başından beri aslında geleneksel galeri ekranlarında hiç görülmedi. Daha ziyade onlar kiliseler, hayır kurumları binalarında ve sadece bunlara talep gösteren galerilerde sergilendiler. Ve bunlar hiçbir zaman güzel fotoğraf baskıları olarak basılmadılar. Posterler olarak sergilendiler. Ve 5000 adet basılan bu baskılar 10 sterline satıldılar posterler ve Salgado aslında bu parayı da yine elde edilen parayı MST'ye aktardı ve bu posterlerin reprodüksiyon kaliteleri ve işte siyasi aktivistlerin, hayır işçilerinin yanı sıra sanatseverlerin aslında bunların izleyicisi olan bir güzel sanatlar eserinden çok aslında barındırdıklarıyla ilgilenmelerini sağladı. Ve bu bağımsızlık hareketinin resimleri olarak ortaya çıktı. Ve bir taraftan da Orta ve Güney Amerika'daki propaganda araçları olarak da tarihe geçti. Yes.
In the pictures of these MST settlements, Salgado is photographing people for whom hope in a modest way has materialized, both through subjects, though both subjects and photographers seem painfully aware of its fragility. Befitting activist photography, the focus has shifted from past to future, and it may be that Salgado has pursued this interest a little too self-consciously in a sequence of photographs of the children of the landless, most of them close-ups of very beautiful children looking into the lens who appear to have a melancholy knowledge of their fate well beyond their years. It's not that death has retreated. These portraits are brought into contrast with pictures of the scenes following the massacre at Para, but the pictures are at once fixed on present tragedy and warn of a future which might hold more of the same, but which also might hold something better. Salgado's pictures helped to globalize awareness of the MST and enabled it to foster links with other radical farmers' movements. Now, I have to say this was a high watermark for Salgado's activism, and his more recent photographs fixed on pristine wilderness and far more securely seen as high art, what he's moved towards, and also very frequent outings at art fairs and so on. But then he is using money to restore the money that he gets from this to restore a rainforest in Brazil.
MST yerleşimlerinin bu fotoğraflarında Salgado hem özneler hem fotoğrafçılar ve onların kırılganlıklarını, acılarını farklı bir şekilde yansıtmış olsa da aslında bir taraftan da ümidin mütevazı bir şekilde somutlaştırıldığı imgeler, bu insanların portreleri, aktivist fotoğrafçılığına onun uygun olarak odağa geçmişten geleceğe bir kayıt yapmak aslında ve ilgiyi de bu topraksız çocuklara ve aslında objektife bakan bu çocukların bir dizi fotoğraflarında belgeliyor ve onların aslında yaşamlarının önemli sürelerini, yani kaderlerini belirleyen bu yıllar onun belgelerinde ortaya çıkıyor. Bu nedenle aslında Para katliamından sonraki sahneler resimleriyle bir kontrast oluşturuyor bu eserler ve mevcut bir trajediye sabitleniyorlar ama daha fazlasını da barındırıyorlar gelecek için. Özellikle hani bu baskılar açlık, zor, kötü bir şekilde ödüllendirilmiş olan emekle geçen hayatlar ve daha iyi belki barındırılabilecek bir hayat. Bir taraftan da Salgado'nun resim, yani fotoğrafları farklı bir şekilde de aslında bu defada Amazon ormanlarını korumak ve farkındalığı çevresel faktörleri arttırmak için de sanat fuarlarındaki sergilenen eserlerinde ortaya çıkıyor. Yes.
Okay, I'm a bit worried about how long this is taking with the translation. So what I'm going to do is just talk very briefly about the next example, which is Alan Sekula, a very well-known photographer for sophisticated documentary projects like this one. And at the protests against the Seattle World Trade Organization meeting in 1999, he took a series of photographs, which is shown usually as a slideshow in a gallery, but also appeared in this book. And I won't show you the whole thing, but I'll just show you a few examples from it. It starts with a white globe, and then it moves to these photographs.
And I will summarize.
Yeah.
Okay.
In this series called Waiting for Tear Gas.
Okay. Diğer bahsedeceğim kişi Alan Sekula. Aslında onun önemli bir işi var. O da Waiting for Tear Gas adlı işi. Aslında o da farklı bir açıdan ABD'li bir sanat fotoğrafçısı ve fotoğraf teorisyeni olarak daha farklı sofistike bir açıdan bakıyor benzer olaya. Onun Fish Story, Deniz Ticareti adlı eseri ve de Dünyayı Sarsan 5 Gün adlı eserinde ortaya çıkan fotoğrafik kareler aslında onun da benzer açılardan eleştirilerini içeriyor. Seküla alışılmadık bir şekilde aslında çok fazla metin içermeden direkt fotoğrafın size sunduklarıyla, yani fotonun kendisinin konuşmasıyla mesajını veriyor. Yes.
So Sekula, like Salgado, was putting himself at the service of a political movement and was open about doing so. But this was very unusual at that time, and a much more common model for those who felt driven to make political art was to deny that this work was meant to have a political effect, saving themselves from the charge of making propaganda and from banishment from the art world. And one of these was Regina Galindo, an extraordinary Guatemalan performance artist.
Aslında Sekula kendisini çok fazla politik olayların içine sokmak isteyen bir sanatçı değil. Ama Galindo, ona baktığımız zaman Guatemalalı sanatçı, o aslında kadına şiddet, adaletsizlik gibi temaları işleyen bir kadın olarak, bir aktivist olarak öne çıkıyor. Yes.
So in her most celebrated work, Who Can Erase the Traces, she walked barefoot through the streets of Guatemala City from the Palace of Culture, National Palace of Culture, to the Constitutional Court, carrying a basin filled with human blood into which she periodically dipped her feet. And this trail of bloody footprints visualized her reaction to the recent news that Efrain Rios Montt, a former military dictator responsible for, or genocide, in fact, he was found responsible for, had been permitted to run for president despite constitutional prohibitions which should have prevented him from standing. He did lose the election at least.
Bu sanatçının en ünlü eseri İzleri Kim Silebilir adlı 2003'teki bir işi. Bir leğenin içine insan kanı doldurup ayaklarını onun içine daldırıp ayak izlerini ülkenin farklı yerlerinde yürüyerek aslında o dönemin askeri diktatörü Efrain Rios Montt'un bir taraftan da hani politik anlamda da onun seçilmemesini sağlayacak faktörle sanatı önceliklendiren bir aktivizme dönüşüyor. Yes.
This was a typically brave and dangerous performance made in uncontrolled circumstances and under the eyes of the police. And Galindo has gone on to make a lot of work about, particularly about violence against women in Guatemala and elsewhere. So in this work, for instance, she had herself, her naked body wrapped in plastic and dumped in garbage, which is a common fate for women who are murdered there. And Galindo says of this work, it's a passive image. I wasn't trying to get a reaction or an active response from the audience. It's a look at reality. Apart from setting up an image, the point of this performance was to spark people's capacity to analyze and provide a critical way of looking at things, to lead viewers into a discussion and make them think. So thinking, not acting, which I think is the important thing here.
Guatemala ve Meksika'da kadınların rutin olarak öldürülmesi, parçalanmasına, hükümetin kayıtsızlığına cevaben aslında yaptığı çalışmalardan bir tanesi bu. Vücudunu plastiğe sarıyor ve o durumda çoğunlukla kadınların çöpe atıldığını aslında anlatan bu işi hakkında Galindo şöyle söylüyor. Bu pasif bir imaj. Seyircilerden bir tepki ya da aktif bir tepki almaya çalışmıyorum. Gerçeğe bir bakış yapıyorum ve bu imajı oluşturmanın yanı sıra bu performansın amacı herhangi bir parçada olduğu gibi insanların analiz etme kapasitesini tetiklemek ve olaylara eleştirel bir bakış açısı sağlamalarını tetiklemek. Yes.
And more recently at Documented 14 in Kassel, she showed this work, a video, The Shadow, in which she runs endlessly around a rectangular track, chased by a Leopard battle tank of the kind made in Kassel, at times apparently on the point of collapse, at others gathering her strength. So this is fragile flesh before the inhuman petrol-driven war machine, which grinds and clanks behind the artist.
Bu Documenta 14'te sergilenen Gölge adlı iş aslında Kassel'de yapılan türde bir Leopard savaş tankı üzerinde koşan bir kadının performans video görüntüsü. Aslında arkadan gelen tankın sesleri ve onun altında ezilecek olan kişinin korkusu ve en önemlisi onun önündeki kişinin kırılgan bedenine dikkati çeken, bir taraftan da devlet güçlerine karşı mücadelenin eşsiz karakterini öne çıkaran bir eser. Yes.
So, as I said, Galindo thinks that, or said at the time, back in the 90s, I don't believe that art can change the world. The problems that cause the injustice must be addressed. And it was strange, really, this. I think, why act out on your own body the violence done to others if you really expect it to have no outcome? But the ethos of the art world at that time was so much against activist art that you risked having your work dismissed as propaganda if you said it would have a political effect.
Galindo şöyle düşünüyor. Sanatın dünyayı değiştirebileceğine inanmıyorum. Adaletsizliğe neden olan sorunlar farklı bir şekilde ele alınmalı ama yine de bu tür ifadelerle gerçekten sonuç vermeyeceğini düşünüyorsanız bile başkalarına uygulanan şiddeti kendi bedeninizde aslında neden uyguluyorsunuz? Sanat dünyasının aslında ahlakı, sanatın politik bir kullanımın aracı olması gerektiğini düşünmüyorum. Politik değişim yaratmak için aslında izleyiciye göre hareket edebilir sanat. Sanatçıyı ve izleyiciyi yaratıcı, yorumlayıcı özgürlükten diğer türlü mahrum bırakıyorsunuz ve sanat dünyasının kolektif karakterine de karşı duyuyorsunuz. Yes.
So this, I think, has really changed. A number of prominent artists now don't need to deny their activism or seek it out or qualify it, but declare it openly. And some artists have become celebrated because of their activism, and their activism is seen as one of the most interesting things about them. So this is true of some of the most famous artists in the world, including Ai Weiwei, with his efforts to publicize and improve conditions for refugees, among many other causes. or Tania Bruguera in her various struggles with the Cuban state and with political oppression more widely.
Ancak tabii bazı önde gelen sanatçılar aktivizmleriyle öne çıkıyorlar ve kutlanıyorlar bir taraftan. Bunlara örnek olarak Çinli Ai Weiwei örnek olarak verilebilir ya da Tania Bruguera. Yes.
And to look at a particularly clear example of this, we can look at the work of Zanele Muholi. She photographs gay and lesbian people in South Africa in ways which might seem very familiar, a kind of genre of rather ethnographic portrait photography that you see in the art world. But this is quite different. First, that this is a Black artist critically interrogating ethnographic history and photography to make portraits that are meant to show active subjects. And second, that they're made in the explicit defense of these people who are subject to very great dangers, especially of sexual assault and murder. And when Muholi speaks, it is as much about her subjects and their lives and the political circumstances of South Africa as it is about photography. And she uses the funds from the sales of these expensive works to help these people, especially in running workshops so they can gain the skills to better represent themselves.
Diğer önemli sanatçılardan biri Zanele Muholi. O da Güney Afrikalı bir sanatçı. Gay ve lezbiyen kişilerin fotoğraflarını çekiyor ve bu sayede aslında bu fotoğrafların ve sergilerden gelen gelirleri onların yararına kullanıyor. Bu seri fotoğraflar etnografik bir belgeleme çalışması ve bu fon ve ayrıca atölye çalışmaları da yapıyor bu kişiler için ve onların tehlikede olan yaşamlarına bir farkındalık yapıyor. Yes.
Again, I'm just going to talk about this example very quickly, given the time. So this is Shahid Al-Alam, who was started working as a photojournalist in Bangladesh and photographing the democracy movements there, but has gone on to have to gain a substantial reputation as an activist and to some extent as an artist, and celebrated by some Western art institutions. I'll just show you little bits of his work here. But particularly when he was arrested for dissent, essentially, by the Bangladeshi government, there was a huge campaign to try and get him released. And his work has been shown in many museums. But again, I think the point is that he's celebrated for his activism as much as for his art.
Diğer aktivizmi nedeniyle öne çıkan, yani sanatçı kimliğinden daha önce Shahid Alam, o da Bangladeşli bir fotoğraf sanatçısı ve tabii bu aktivist hareketleri nedeniyle ve yaptığı röportaj nedeniyle tutuklanıp epeyce bir süre gözaltında kalıyor. Aslında o da sanatından çok aktivizmi ile öne çıkıyor. Yes.
Okay, so these individuals could just be seen as exceptional individuals, and so sort of folded into the art world with its bourgeois exceptionalism. But also from the mid-90s, you get artists collectives making political work. Particularly in online space, as corporations push to change the internet from forum to mall. So one of the most notorious acts was staged by the artwork corporation eToy. It was called Digital Hijack. And so they manipulated the search engines at the time so that if you typed in popular search terms such as Madonna or Porsche or Penthouse, their link came up first. And if you clicked on that result, you got to this screen, which gave you various messages, and it was impossible to move away from, and also played an audio file about the plight of imprisoned hacker Kevin Mitnick. So eToy became even more well known for a campaign against the giant online corporation eToys, which sold toys online, and at the time was one of the largest digital sales companies. So the domain names of these two, eToy and eToys, differ just by one letter. And eToy had registered their name some years before the toy company.
İnternet üzerinden paylaşımlara baktığımız zaman aktivizm aslında iki tane siteden söz edebiliriz. 1990'ların ortasına itibaren iki tane firma, biri eToy, bu aslında dijital platformda sanatı yaymayı hedefleyen, fakat bu site bir şekilde ele geçiriliyor ve iki şirket arasında uzunca sürecek olan bir çatışmaya neden oluyor. Çok ünlü bir dev olan eToys'la bu eToy arasındaki çekişme enteresan bir durum. Yes.
So the dispute between the two began in 1999 when the toy company started receiving complaints from potential customers who'd ended up at the art site finding nudity, obscene words, and even a photograph of the Oklahoma City bomb site, along with the caption, "This work needs a lot of training." So eToys are very worried about the kind of pollution of their brand by this art content, and also didn't like the anti-corporate and intent to disrupt business on the part of eToy. So they took the company to court, the art site to a court, and won an injunction closing down the eToy site.
Ve bu iki firma arasındaki çekişme 1999'da zirveye çıktı ve eToys kendi karakterini çalan sanat sitesinden şikayet de bulundu ve daha sonra da aralarında, yani paylaşımlar anlamında da sorunlar olduğu için yani sitenin sanatsal değeri olup olmadığı konusunda da tartışmalar başladı. Yes.
So the closure of the eToy site was a dramatic development. A large commercial site had attacked an art site with litigation and taken it off the internet. So the company's calculation was doubtless that the art site would give up when faced with the costs of court action, but they picked the wrong group to tangle with. As one digital activist wondered, why did they choose to pursue in an openly hostile manner an art group best known for a piece called The Digital Hijack, which made sophisticated use of technology to playfully attack users' browsers? It wouldn't take an Einstein to predict trouble, and trouble duly arrived. eToy ran a fundraising and propaganda campaign from another site, showing toy businessmen and eToy artists on parade. And the campaign became an art work in itself in many ways. And RT Mark, which is another activist group at the time, launched a vocal propaganda campaign setting out to do no less than destroy the toy company. Well, that threat might have seemed foolish, but Artmark and their online supporters knew what they were up to.
Okay. eToy sitesinin kapatılması aslında dramatik bir gelişme. Aslında bir ticari ve sanat sitesine dava ile saldıran ve bu anlaşmazlıkları çözmeye çalışan durumda internetten sitenin kaldırılma gücü enteresan bir durumdu ve aslında kullanıcılarının bu dijital hijack diye tanımlanan sanat grubunu açıkça, düşmanca saldırmak ve ona aslında kapatılmasına doğru gidecek aktivasyonu sağlamak ve bir taraftan da aslında İTOY sanatçıları geçit onlarla ilgili bir bağış toplama ve propaganda kampanyası sürdürülmesi, bir taraftan da oyuncak şirketini yok etmekten daha aslında farklı bir yolu deneyen İTOY sitesinin bu defa sesli propagandalarının başlatılması konularıyla devam eden bir süreç başladı. Yes.
Yes, so that's one of the part of the propaganda campaign. Among the tools used was a denial of service attack invented by an artist group. It was a sort of manual denial of service attack, and it was used to shut down the site or in the crucial days before Christmas, preventing online ordering. And the worst thing about it for eToys was that they couldn't rely on, they didn't know how many customers were visiting their site. And this was the information on which their share price depended. So it's hard to prove exactly that this assault was responsible for the rapid decline in the share companies, in the company's share price that took place. But they lost 70% of their value in this period. And unsurprisingly, they gave up on their court action and indeed paid compensation to eToy. And there's a rider to this affair. The dispute took place in the months before the general fall, the dot-com crash of 2000. And when that came, the already weakened eToys, once a company valued at $9 billion, filed for bankruptcy in 2001. So this was an early example of effective art activism by a collective. And it's not the only one, as we'll see. We'll go on to look at some other artist collectives that have tried to hold museums to account for their actions.
Bu aslında sanat platformunda hizmet veren bir sitenin eToys'a karşı kullandığı yöntemler. Bir taraftan da aslında şirketin cirosunu ve karını düşündüğümüzde aslında kar düşüşü ve hisselerinin de aslında fiyatının hızla düşmesini sağlamak, değerini aslında yitirmesini sağlamakla kendisini gösteren bir hareket. Bir taraftan aslında şirket 9 milyar dolarlıkken 2000'li yıllardan sonra 2001'de iflas başvurusu yaptı. Yes.
So the branch of the Guggenheim which is planned to open in Abu Dhabi's Saadiyat Island Museum complex, is to be a massive luxury building designed, as in Bilbao, by Frank Gehry. It's a model of it. And the contrast between such a lavish display of wealth and the conditions of the migrant workers working on it, or to work on it, are stark. In violation of barely enforced labor laws, many of these people are held in debt slavery, enforced by the confiscation of their passports, and for the troublemakers by beatings and deportations. They live in squalid communal housing and work in very hazardous circumstances. So in March 2014, a group called Global Ultra Luxury Faction protested these conditions by dropping thousands of bits of paper designed to look like dollar bills into the famous atrium of the New York Museum. These banknotes were graced with pictures of the design for the Abu Dhabi building, the slogan "No Sustainable Value," and 1%, 1% of the Occupy movement, of course, printed in each corner. The Guggenheim reacted strongly against this action, taking the extraordinary step of shutting down the museum. So many further actions followed, including their slide projection on the side of the building, as I showed you there. And artistic interventions such as this poster made by the veteran political activist and artist Hans Hacker. Despite all this activity over a long period of time, the Guggenheim has proved intransigent and simply pushes aside any responsibility for workers' rights.
Abu Dhabi'de Saayat adası üzerinde Frank Gehry tarafından tasarlanan Guggenheim'ın bir diğer şubesi 2011'de aslında yani 2011'de inşasına başlanan bir projeydi. Aslında çok fazla finansın yatırıldığı bir yerde çalışan göçmen işçilerin koşullarının çok limitli olması, iş yasalarına aykırı olarak çalıştırılmaları, onların pasaportlarına el konulması, sınır dışı edilme, dayak gibi konularla karşı karşıya kalmaları sonucunda Mart 2014'te Global Ultra Luxury Faction adlı bir grup New York'taki Guggenheim Müzesi'nin avlusunda üzerinde bu yapının olduğu bir para banknotları havaya attılar. Bu bir protest eylemdi ve hatta bu Guggenheim Müzesi'nin devamının hani yapılmasına da tepki gösteren bir proje. Aynı zamanda da diğer aktivist Hans Hacke'nin bir posteri de yapının konstrükte edilmekte olan yapının üstünde sergilendi. Yes.
BP is a great company. This was the closing line of a speech to a crowd of invited art world folk at a Tate event. The boldness of the statement was unusual, but the sentiment, repeated again and again, is what BP's sponsorship money buys. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, the largest marine oil spill in history, which devastated the ecology of the Gulf of Mexico, spurred the campaign to free the arts from the oil company funding, and it was met with a swift and blunt response. The Royal Opera House, Tate, the British Museum, and the National Portrait Gallery all said they would keep taking the oil company money. The then Tate director, Nicholas Sirota's justification was, you don't abandon friends because they have a temporary difficulty. While corporations acquire the legal status of persons to exploit freedom of speech laws for their propaganda and to freely purchase political influence, the idea that one can be your friend is plainly absurd. And should loyalty always trump other ethical impulses, you might choose to reflect on your choice of friends when they bring about their own difficulties by criminality and greed.
BP'nin harika bir şirket olduğunu aslında söyleyen Tate'in yöneticisi Nicholas Sirota, Meksika Körfezi'nde 2010 yılında ekolojiyi oldukça tahrip eden büyük petrol sızıntısı, bu Deepwater Horizon felaketi olarak biliniyor. Ve bu felaketin aslında olması ardından yaşanan ve BP'nin sponsorluğunda yaşamını sürdüren Kraliyet Opera Binası, Tate, British Museum ve Ulusal Portre galerilerinin aslında hala parayı almaya devam etmesi üzerinden bu konuşması ilginçti. Böyle bir durumda hani arkadaşlarına bağlılığını sürdürmeye devam et gibi bir ifadesi vardı. Ve bu şirketlerin aslında bu kurumları desteklemeleri, bir taraftan da bu kurumların da sadakatle onları desteklemeleri üzerine yapılan bu konuşma oldukça ilginçti. Yes.
So BP hoped to that the subliminal association of its brand with art would act against images and memories such as these and the general tide of filth and corruption and violence for which they're responsible. So this use of museums by oil companies was too much for some artists, who assembled into a group called Liberate Tate to make a series of imaginative and spectacular protest performances, such as this, and which included bringing a massive wind turbine blade into the Tate's turbine hall as a gift for the collection. Now, this group was difficult to attack or suppress because they are artists. One of the most prominent is the performance artist Haley Newman. And what they're doing is plainly, in some sense, art. Calling in the police would have been very bad publicity. And it took them 6 years, but their continuous and creative actions eventually forced Tate to abandon its long alliance with BP.
Ve bu petrol firmalarının çevreyi özellikle çok kirleten çalışmaları ve ölü işçiler, yasa dışı çöplükler gibi sorunlara bu defa Liberate Tate diye bir organizasyonla, bir protesto eylemiyle sanatçılar, önde gelen performans sanatçısı Haley Newman, büyük türbün salonuna dev bir rüzgar türbini kanadı getirdiler. Buraya polisin girmesi zordu. Çünkü bu sanatsal bir aktiviteydi. Ve bu şekilde de Tate'i aslında BP ile uzun süreli ittifakında terk etmeye zorladılar. Yes.
And this isn't the only example. Many art institutions have been embarrassed by taking money from the Sackler family, who made much of their money from the sale of OxyContin, an addictive and dangerous drug missold and misprescribed on a vast scale in the US, leading to tens of thousands of deaths annually and many more ruined lives. In 2019, renowned photographer Nan Goldin, famed for her series The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, and herself a victim of this drug, threatened to withdraw her major retrospective show at the National Portrait Gallery in London, unless it turned down a £1 million Sackler donation, and the gallery gave in.
Bu sadece Tate için geçerli değil. Aslında Courtauld'da dahil olmak üzere bir dolu sanat kurumu paralarını bu şirketlerden alıyorlar. Sackler ailesinin mesela OxyContin ve ağrı kesicilerde bağımlılık yaratan maddeyi çeşitli ülkelerdeki satışı ABD'ye aslında büyük ölçekte yanlış satılan, reçete edilen bu ürünün her yıl bir dolu insanın ölmesine neden olması. O da Nan Goldin'in 2019'da ünlü fotoğrafçının kendisi kurban olan fotoğraflık eserinde aslında ortaya farklı bir şeyi koydu. 1 milyon sterlinlik Sackler bağışını geri çevirmediği takdirde Ulusal Portre Galerisi'nde büyük retrospektif gösterisini geri çekme tehdidinde bulundu ve galeride buna teslim oldu. Yes.
Now, these are not isolated examples, and a faction of the art world engages more and more with socially useful art and political activism. So in 2012, radical artist Artur Szymewski curated the 7th Berlin Biennial, calling for an exhibition which resembles a parliament rather than a salon, and trying to bring voices in who are usually ideologically excluded from the art world. So among the interventions, Occupy were invited to inhabit the largest space at the main venue and to collaborate and create actions which included an invasion of the Pergamon Museum in Berlin to protest the colonial seizure of cultural artifacts. The results were widely reviled by conservative critics on aesthetic grounds, and with reason, because the explicit aim was to lift what Szymewski calls artistic immunity from questions of social use. and indeed not to be content just to ask questions, but to find answers, especially in solving the economic problems of the impoverished majority.
Diğer radikal sanatçılardan bir tanesi 2012'de Polonyalı Artur Zmijewski, Joanna Warshaw ve Wojna grubu ile birlikte 7. Berlin Bienalinin küratörlüğü sırasında aslında ideolojik nedenlerle müzelerde, galerilerde nadiren konuşmalarına izin verilen bireyleri, toplulukları içeren salondan ziyade parlamentoya benzeyen bir sergi çağrısında bulunuyorlar. Occupy aslında Berlin'deki Pergamon Museum'un ana mekanındaki geniş alanda aslında bu kolonyal tavra bir protesto ve eylem niteliğinde ve Jamazewski'nin aslında öne sürdüğü sanatsal dokunulmazlık olarak adlandırdığı sosyal kullanım sorunlarını kaldırmak ve gerçekten soru sormak değil de cevap bulmak ve ekonomik sorunların da aslında yoksul çoğunluğun ekonomik sorunlarına da çözüm bulma amaçlıydı. Yes.
And briefly, another example was the 2015 Venice Biennale, in which Marxism was very evident, and the artist Isaac Julian addressed Marx directly through his works, including this video piece, but also in having Capital read each day in the central auditorium of the main pavilion at Venice. And Marx was listed as an artist in the catalogue.
2013'te de aynı şekilde Isaac Julian Venedik Bienalinde Marx'ın Kapitalini okuyarak aslında bir reaksiyon göstermek istedi. Yes.
So what we see here is part of a convergence of political discourse and image making. In protest, performance, politics, artistic creation, and recording become inextricably entangled. Sorry, that's Marx at Venice. Should have shown that earlier. A key example is the book block, a response to police violence against anti-capitalist protesters, in which shields in the form of book covers were made both to protect protesters and to display the titles of works of culture and political thought. So this block is designed when the police attack to produce images of the assault on learning and culture. So it's as much a performance a device as a shield.
Bu kitap kapaklarında öne çıkan aslında yasaklanmış kitaplar ve buna bir tepkinin yine politik aktivist bir şekilde yansıma bulması. Yes.
Actually, these are my students doing the same thing for an anti-austerity protest in London. As David Graeber writes, little irks the police more than the temporary. Sorry, that's how to make a book block. Little irks the police more than temporary sculptural figures carried by demonstrators known as puppets, which mock monuments and are often accompanied by musicians, clowns, and jugglers in a carnival atmosphere. These upstage the police, tower over them, and satirize their political masters. And the police often make extraordinary efforts to seize them and then smash them to pieces.
Burada yine aynı şekilde bu defa Washington'da yine iklimle ilgili farklı grupların yürüyüşünü görüyoruz. Yes.
This high passion, both to make elaborate protest works in the first place and the passion of others to destroy them, seems rare in capitalist culture. In her remarkable book, Our Aesthetic Categories, Siam Ngai writes of the decline of the old experiences of the sublime and the beautiful in favor of three newly dominant modes, the zany, the cute, and the interesting. And these are better geared, she thinks, to capitalist culture. The zany is associated with production, the cute with consumption, and the merely interesting with distribution. All offer pallid and contradictory experiences, not life-transforming, but rather passively consumed with a giggle or an ah or a nod of respect. Compared to the struggles of avant-garde artists and those who sought to understand what they had made, and for whom aesthetic disputes, modes of expression, and the failure to live up to ideals might be a matter of life and death, they have a faint and tenuous hold on the psyche.
Bir diğer aslında sanatçı, kapitalist kültürü irdeleyen Sian Niagi, Amerikan aslında sanatçısı. Estetik Kategorileri adlı eserinde farklı modları inceliyor. Yüce olan, güzelin eski deneyiminin düşüşü, yeni baskın 3 mod, bunlar kapitalizme ayarlanmış zani diye nitelendirdiği sevimli ve ilginç olan bir kültür. Bir de çılgın üretim, sevimli tüketim kültürü gibi. Aslında bunlar tabii ki farklı deneyimlerin ürünleri, fakat hayatı da çok fazla değiştirmiyorlar. Aslında pasif bir şekilde tepkiye yol açıyorlar. Bir taraftan avantgard sanatçılar ve onların ne yaptıklarını anlamaya çalışanlar ve onların öne sürdükleri estetik tartışmaları düşünürsek, ifade tarzı, ideale ulaşamamanın hani ölüm kalım meselesi olduğu duruma biraz daha farklı bir bakış açısı taşıyor. Yes.
So this is my last point then. It may be that the grand works of contemporary art still strive to overawe the viewer with sublime spectacle, often fall flat or carry with them the whiff of Hollywood cliché. So it may be that currently the most powerful aesthetic experiences are found in the vertigo of rebellion and collective action, of art put to use in an increasingly urgent struggle to defend the environment and the future of humanity itself. As Yeats Key remarks in this book, Strike Art, in the culture of Occupy, there could be glimpsed the end of contemporary art as it dissolved into an expanding field of social engagement. Art's bewitching suspension between political use and ideal autonomy, social action and immunity is falling apart in an increasingly banal cycle of money-making opposed by this culture of overt activism. In this development, there's a foretaste of the closing stages of that compact contemporary art in a new and radically polarized politics and in ongoing catastrophe. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, but let me
yes.
quickly translate this. Yeats McKee'nin Strike Art'ta öne sürdüğü gibi aslında çağdaş sanatın genişleyen sosyal angajman alanına baktığımız zaman sanatın siyasi kullanım ile ideal özellik, sosyal eylem, dokunulmazlık arasındaki dengeleri ve açık bir aktivizm kültürünün karşı çıktığı, gittikçe sıradanlaşan bir para kazanma döngüsü. Bunlar aslında yeni ve kökten kutuplaşmış bir politikada devam eden aslında bir felaket gibi düşünülebilir. Çağdaş sanatın aslında kapanış aşamasının sanki bir ön adımı gibi. Özetleyecek olursak aslında 1990'ların politik sanatı aslında ve onun ortaya getirdiği sanatsal dünya ve politik değişimlere neden olma etkisi, internet üzerinden daha farklı olan bir politik sanat ve e-toys örneğinde olduğu gibi aslında kanıtlanmış bir etki yaşayan çevrim içi sanat platformu. Bir taraftan da teröre karşı ve iç savaşlar, finansal krizler ve aktivist çatışmalar, Ivy gibi sanat dünyasına kolayca uyum sağlayan bireysel sanatçıların önerileri ve bir taraftan da müzelere karşı hareket eden aktivist gruplar ve bunların aslında kültürel ifadeleri, yani sanatla aktivizm arasındaki uçurumun daha gözenekli bir hale geldiği bir çağ aslında yaşıyoruz. Thank you very much. Now we will start asking our guests if they have questions or comments. So I will give a chance for those who would like to ask questions. Sorusu olan var mı? Julian'a. Evet. Soruları alabiliriz. Kısaca kendinizi tanıtıp sorulara girebiliriz. No questions?
Hocam sorabilir miyim?
Tabii. Lütfen.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm an architect and a former student of Billur Hoca in museology. I want to ask a question with two sub-questions in it, actually, that I believe they rely on each other. In your books and articles, you talk about how the consumer culture, or let's say the mass culture today, has dominated the contemporary art and the artists who position themselves in this. Do you see any cracks possible? Can you say some possible cracks for the artists in the system to create and survive freely from this, especially related to contemporary arts that are based on traditional crafts and hand-built arts? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that. I should say that the Turkish translation of my book is now, it's based on the old version, which is quite old. So in part what I've been doing here is trying to update some of the things that I wrote in that book, because I think the situation has changed quite a lot. And I think there are more opportunities now for artists to make things which depart from that commodified world that I looked at. I think there are indeed cracks in the system, and I've been trying to show some of them today, which come out of the many crises that we're living through. I think always there've been, one of the attractions of art has been that, you know, you might be able to carve out some kind of autonomous creative world for yourself, and to, at least for some of the time, and exist in that way. Well, maybe two things to say about that at the moment. One is that if you're trying to live off the money from that, that becomes increasingly difficult for many people, because of rising rents and declining prices for art, except at the very top end. But, you know, I think that there have always been other ways of doing this, especially for those artists like Galindo, for instance, whose presence is very important to her art. So performance artists, some craft-based practices, where essentially it's not the object that is bought so much as the authenticity of the artist's action and presence in a particular place.
Thank you very much.
I should also mention I've updated the book, so I'm really hoping that that will appear in Turkish at some point.
Thank you. Any other questions?
May I? Phyllis.
Yes.
Oh, thank you for your talk. What I am interested in to know is what is the relationship between the press, newspapers, media, between the press and press owners and these activist artists and photographers. Is there censorship in those countries where they do perform and show their activist art?
I mean, that varies obviously from country to country. And as I was saying, I mean, for Galindo to do her work in Guatemala was actively dangerous, not, well, perhaps not directly because of the government, although that's repressive enough, but also because of others, militia and forces and so on, who might object to it. Obviously, your own country currently is in a far from free situation in this regard. The press, I think, well, there are a couple of things to say about this. One is that it's in decline in relationship to social media, which is another big issue, and their control over the engines of publicity is very much weakened. Another is that they are very opportunistic. So if Ai Weiwei, for instance, and big branded artists like that are doing activist work, they can be sure that that work will be reported, at least outside China. So it's a mixed and contradictory situation, and there are, as always, there are many artists who set out to exploit that situation. Obviously, the press is generally, although not completely, owned by very reactionary billionaires who impose their own agendas. But I think art often slips under the radar a little bit in relationship to that. Also combined, as I say, with the very big pressures on the press and on journalists to produce stories very quickly, and their opportunism, commercial opportunism.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, questions? So I will ask a question.
Hocam ben sorabilirim.
Tamam, sen sor, sonra ben sorayım.
İyi akşamlar herkese. I'm working at Ankara University and my department is Conservation and Restoration of Cultural Properties. And I'm also a master's student at Başkent University under the consultancy of Birlir Tekkök. I deal with keeping records of human nations through their material remains, mainly ethnocultural point of view. I see the trend on this field is in increase in last year's biennials. When especially and African nations are being presented by very tough happenings. Can you tell us how you see this in 20 years? Thank you.
Quite sure I get the question. Is it that there's more, at biennials, you've seen more work which is about conservation and restoration of older artifacts, is that right?
It's, I think, rather the representation of ethnocultures.
Ethnocultural, yes.
Oh, I see.
Mainly,
okay.
Yeah, ethnocultural point of view.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that is indeed quite a big trend, which we've seen over the past 10 years or so, I guess. Although there are places, especially such as Australia and Canada, maybe, where the trend is older and not so much linked with biennials necessarily. And I think it's very much tied up with the environmental crisis and in part with the decolonial movement as well. And and the idea that one can should enter into dialogue and learn from indigenous people and their cultures. So it was very strong, for instance, at Documenta 14, that trend. But I mean, I think more generally, it's a big deal. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, obviously, but at the moment, it seems to have a lot of momentum behind it, that engagement. Is that what you were asking? Is that the right thing to talk about?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Başka sorusu ya da yorumu olan var mı? Okay, then I will ask a question. So since, I mean, 1946, after the great manifesto by Lucia Fontana, that any, I mean, life experience could be a form of art. How do you value then art in general? Especially you criticize British young artists. So tell us, how do you define the value of art for your category? The big question.
Wow, that is a big question.
But that's the core of your actually scope.
Okay, I'll try and say something reasonably brief about that. And I guess that my practice as a critic and a writer has always been about trying to think about what intervention and artwork makes in different circumstances. Maybe the circumstances of its creation, or maybe in different places where it's displayed, and so on. And to think about the climate of reception, what's going on politically and otherwise. I mean, I think it's clear that artists don't always know what they're doing, okay, any more than writers do, okay? So you make something, you put it out there, and it has an effect, which is often unpredictable. In a very kind of chaotic climate of reception. I mean, a wonderful example of this is a dialogue between Gerhard Richter and Benjamin Buchloh about the character of Richter's painting. And Richter has his own view of this, and Buchloh has a very elaborate view, which is completely different from Richter's. And arguably more interesting and pertinent than what Richter thinks he's up to, okay? So I guess I've never wanted to privilege the artist's view of their own practice, and I try to set it in a larger setting and see whether it has value in that way. This is not exactly a moral judgment or even an aesthetic one, but it's to do with what happens when the artwork meets the wider environment, if you like.
Thank you. But when you teach art history, I mean, you start from earlier periods and you move on. And when you come, especially to periods after 2000, it is problematic, right? I mean, considering the wide geography, wide angle, and also variety of artworks. It's no longer like in Renaissance time period. It's very standard if you, I mean, think how to approach actually to artwork. As you indicated in your talk, it is formed with different feelings and impacts. And when an artist or art critic writes about art nowadays, the person has to think in a wider angle. All the political movements, as you have mentioned, and the reasons behind the creation, and also the input the artists put in the artwork, And I mean, 20 years from today, if a person is writing about this art, their value judgment will be different, right?
Yeah, almost certainly, yes. Yes. I mean, there are certain things that seem fairly fixed over that kind of time period. I mean, you know, I suppose I've been surprised by the durability of the work of Damien Hirst, for instance, at least in market terms. And as a sort of speculative asset, it seems to, you know, to continue to do very well with some ups and downs, and not change very much in terms of its reception or the way it's written about and so on. You're right, of course, that there's been a massive diversification of the art world really since the end of the Cold War, and ongoing in various uneven, but, you know, very striking ways. And that opens up all sorts of problems for art history in particular, whether you can have a global art history, and if so, how you handle it, and all the issues of decolonization and so on. What to say about that? And there's, in addition to that, there's a problem which I suppose that I've been dealing with for a long time, which is this possibly paradoxical attempt to write an art history of the contemporary period, which lots of other people have been thinking about as well, and trying to think about what the character of the contemporary period is. So all of these things come together, and they make for a very difficult, but on the other hand, very fascinating field of study, I think. I can talk a bit more about some of the ways in which I approach that if you want, but I don't know, maybe it would be too complicated a reply.
But next time, certainly.
Okay.
Also, how do you see this imperial attitude? I mean, when we considered Far Eastern biennales and also the galleries in the Far East, especially American galleries presenting themselves in Singapore and in different Far Eastern countries, and also the notions of the last 5 years in Venice Biennale. So, I mean, the topics change, and also it's no longer an art society or to present art, but it's more a political move in a way.
Okay, well, the Venices kind of oscillate, I think, often, and that often you find that a curator is appointed and will try to make their mark by making their biennial edition very different from the last one. So it's hard to see necessarily particular trends running through those sequences of events. I think in relationship to these big American galleries, for instance, setting up many branches all around the world, that's partly to do with it's a response to the globalization of the art market, but it's also to do with the way in which, especially since the financial crisis, the art world has become even more steeply hierarchical than it used to be. So there are a few very big global gallery brands and auction house brands come to that at the top, which take vast amounts of all the trade going on and very little left for those underneath. Okay, so there's partly that, but I think also interesting in relationship to this is what might be called the deglobalizing tendencies of the recent period, and particularly that take China as the most powerful example of this. It seems to me that a lot of Chinese art produced now is produced mostly for Chinese buyers and for internal consumption, and to some extent for propaganda outwards. But I think that the Western viewer in this comes very much second or third place. I mean, that's true in different ways of much Russian art, which is being produced now as well. So it's partly to do with geopolitical rivalry, but it's partly to do, I think, with the sheer weight of these, these markets, which are no longer emerging. They have emerged, right, and are definite counterweights to Western and especially US dominance.
Thank you. Any other questions? Buyurun.
İyi akşamlar. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you a question. Have you studied Turkish activists as, artists?
I have not, I must say. I've been to Turkey on a couple of occasions, and I've seen some Turkish art, but no, I would love you to talk about that a little bit and inform me, if you would.
Well, I don't know really, but I wanted to know whether you have in any way studied them. But
no,
now...
I'm afraid not. I don't. Trying to think now. Whether that anything I can call to mind. No, I mean, I haven't done that study. Obviously, one of these things about this global art history is that you can in no way be comprehensive, and to some extent, you pick perhaps opportunistically sometimes the things that you choose to look at and study. And I think I've done a fairly wide range of them, but not Turkish activism so far. Does anybody have anything they want to say about that?
I mean, I wanted actually to invite one of the activists, but he's not here. He's busy with an exhibition, Genco Gülen. So he's not with us at the moment. But yeah, he has also a website that runs from Istanbul. I will send you the link.
Please, yes.
Thank you.
And it's possible to do such work at the moment. It's yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Gözde Gül.
Good evening, Mr. Stallabrass, and thank you for your presentation. It was a privilege for us listening to you. I'm a student of Professor Dr. In museology studies for my master degree, and my bachelor degree is from law. I'm a lawyer in Ministry of Culture, and I want to integrate my accumulated knowledge of a new world of thinking through art media. As I say, that the unjust system of governments on human nations and corporates dealing with these issues just for tax reduction, but not exactly dealing with human sufferings, reflected through artworks are my main interest, actually. So can you please tell us, in human history, did you ever see a just system on the side of humans reflected through artworks? And thank you.
So I'm sorry, do I see, could you just summarize that question quickly? Sorry, I didn't quite get it.
I will. Shall I? Okay.
Thank
What
you.
she asked, actually, she's a lawyer, so
Yes.
she's interested in human rights mainly.
Yeah.
And all the new corporates dealing with, I mean, artworks, but not on being on the side of humans, but for their tax reduction. So she actually wants to know, were there any chance in any period in human history on the side of humans reflected through artworks?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Here you go, a big question, huh?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I mean, I think is the brief answer to that. It depends, what your view of being on the side of humans is, of course. if we look at the say the long history in the West especially, but in many other places too, of art history, for the most part, it's been on the side of those in power, and quite explicitly so, whether it's the church or the state or the aristocracy and so on. And the break with that really comes with the avant-garde. So you might see the avant-garde and onwards as a kind of exception. And it's plain now in this split in the art world that I've talked about that the more marketized faction, the Jeff Koons of this world, are very much like that old art on the side of the elite, and quite openly so, I think. So have there been arts that have served human rights? And yes, I think, and some continue to do so. I mean, one thing you might point to as a really obvious example is a whole trend of humanist photography, which really started to get going and to be thought through and systematized in the 1930s with the movements of the Popular Front, and had a long life into at least the 1960s, and many distinguished practitioners that pursued that kind of work. And yes, that work was explicitly on the side of humanity and human rights. It had a kind of leftist universalism running behind it. So it's very different from the identity politics of our age. But yes, it was explicitly humanist and passionately interested in human rights.
Thank you. Now there are raised hands. Meryem Soydemir.
Okay. I am Meryem. I am a math teacher and student in museology program. I want to transfer the means of culture history to my students so they have a better understanding of the world and choose right fields in the future. Does your institute have programs for public schools, pre-university education? If so, what type of programs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in the UK, art history has a real problem with the inclusion of a wide group of students coming in. And my institute in particular has a real problem with it, both in terms of ethnic diversity, but also in terms of class. And one of the reasons for this is that art history is barely taught in schools, or only in fee-paying schools, okay? So the kids who get to know about it tend to come from rich parents. So that's one of the issues. So yeah, we have had some projects and programs, and continue to do so, trying to reach out to a more diverse student body, and to get especially children in London schools in poorer areas, to expose them to our history in various ways. I mean, I must say that I do feel the way things are a little bit ambivalent about attracting those students into art history, unless there is support which goes beyond the degree. Because the typical career path for students who leave an art history degree is to do internships all over the place for maybe some, poorly paid or unpaid internships for some considerable time before they get any work. And then when they do get work, that tends to be very poorly paid. Now, if you're from a rich family, fine, you can afford to do that. But I don't know whether it's a realistic career path for many others. So I think it's partly our responsibility, but it's partly tied into much larger social structures which we don't control.
Thank you, Meryem. It was a very good question.
Thank you.
Now Sarah wants to ask a question. Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Hello, Julian. Welcome to Turkey, even for a brief talk on Zoom. Thanks for joining us. I've studied management in my bachelor degree, My family owns a carpet company over 3 generations. And now I'm in museology program to transfer this old tradition into, contemporary level. What I see from your presentation, you focused on, minority, what we call as minority, the invisibles, like people mostly ignore and cross the street. Now what I see, art craft, once an art craft become an art piece. Now we only talk about pieces, and most of those pieces not even crafted by the artist himself. So how should we approach to an art craft in this contemporary world we're talking about? And after all this globalization and culturalization process, all the crafts are dying. So how should we draw attention and approach to this problem? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very interesting question. So there were 2 points there. One was about minorities, I guess, and yeah. I mean, at one kind of extreme of the art world, there's a lot of talk about minorities all the time, and sometimes in rather divisive ways, and almost a kind of competition for victimhood, which is, I think can be worrying and counterproductive. One of the things that it seemed to me that Occupy did briefly, but well, was to say, actually, given the current setup of the world capitalist system, the minorities are not in a sense the problem, or okay, so that's not quite right. They may experience more extreme forms of exploitation than others, but it's the majority that is exploited and excluded, especially from the operations of power. Okay, and indeed, one of the things you've seen is that the economic insecurity have crept higher and higher up the social scale, so that people who used to think of themselves as being secure and well paid and being able to look after their families and provide for their children and so on can no longer do so. Okay, so I think there's an issue with the majority as well as minorities who indeed must be considered. And your other question was about craft. I think that's really interesting. And yes, obviously, there's a way in which many craft practices are under threat and dying out, and for many reasons that we could go into. But I think also you can point to certain places where, and South Korea would be a very good example, where yes, there's been an aggressive modernization, kind of US imposed in that case, which has blotted out many traditional environments and craft practices. But one of the things that you see in the art world is artists re-engaging with those old crafts and making very laborious, meticulous and beautifully made things which draw on those craft practices in various ways. And so, that is one artistic tactic. It's not, okay, so the Jeff Koons of this world who outsource almost all of their manufacture to other people. I mean, that's one model. But, it's very striking that in certain places, and as I say, South Korea is one, that artists can also create value by very laborious craft work.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was an interesting question. Any other questions? We're about to end our lecture, I think. So.
Well, there have been many wonderful questions, so thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Julian. It was a pleasure to host you, in this environment. hopefully after the pandemic, we will invite you to lecture in our university. Thank you very much. It was very useful.
Thank you.
And have a great evening. Tüm katılımcılara çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bir sonraki buluşmamızda tekrar haftaya bu defa sergi düzenlemeleriyle ilgili konuşacağız. Özellikle Türkiye'deki müzeleri şu anda sergilemelerini yapan kişi bizlerle birlikte olacak. Hoşça kalın. İyi akşamlar.